And I'd like to go right ahead and introduce our first speaker, Bill Limpisathian. Bill is a PhD student at the University of Oregon Department of Geography, working with Dr. Amy Lobin. His research interests are in the cognition of visual contrast in cartographic representations, and he recently graduated from Penn State University, working with Dr. Cindy Brewer with his master's degree.
Thanks, Pat. It's great to be here this morning with you guys. Good morning, all. It's a bit early for us West Coast people currently. The clock says 9, but inside it's 5, only 6. With that, I'm gonna try to briefly talk to you. I say try because there's a lot of content, and hopefully I won't go over it a lot at amount of time. But I'm gonna try to briefly talk to you guys about the mainly the results of my master thesis that I did at Penn State with Cindy. Unfortunately, I don't believe Cindy is here yet. She's still en route to NACIS, which is unfortunate and sad. But yeah, especially for me, right? So at first I'm gonna try to go into the background of it, but most of this stuff I already presented at AG if you guys were there, so I'm not gonna try to dig too deep into it, or I might go a little quick so I can focus more on the results section. So if there is questions or whatever, I'm happy to answer any of them at the end. So a background, visual contrast. We're cartographers. We know how important it is in maps. It's essentially what determines what the user sees or what the user is focusing on when they see the map. So it's essential in every map, yet there has always been a somewhat unclear best practice or resources for especially novice map maker when they're trying to get into developing schemes that do have sufficient visual contrast. So that's where this project or thesis topic came from. So this lack of best practice really rears its head when we're actually doing real-world cartographic project that does have design constraints, or we're working with outside stakeholders that limit us to a certain color or certain limitation in terms of design of what we can do. So this one actually spawned from a previous Frank Lloyd Wright National Park Service UNESCO project that I did when at Penn State. And what we essentially thought, or what I essentially thought after it, was that wouldn't it be nice to have a resource that does help us develop a range of uniform scheme that do work across geographies and scales that is effective for visual contrast and still look nice in the end. So that was where this master thesis was born. The overall goal, again, is to make these resources available to help novice cartographers and us professionals or those in academia alike. So I wanted to develop these aesthetically pleasing design schemes that do preserve visual contrast and hierarchy relations. And with some help, I was able to form these research questions. The research questions are formed in a way where it would be able to address at the end, so it's a yes-no approach to the research question, and they basically were that whether higher level of visual contrast of line, lightness, and hue were better for perceived hierarchies in map, and then also for the aesthetic preference. So to do this, I pulled from cartographic literature in visual contrast. So it's been well studied. A range of famous cartographers have gone through this. It's in every cartography textbook. So I'm not going to get too much into this. And they use a range of terms. Different cartographers and different academic use different terms, but essentially to describe the same range of, or the same set of characteristics. But for me, I decided to focus on explicitly the visual contrast of line in combination with lightness and hue. So in addition to theories on visual contrast, I pulled theories from Gestalt psychology, mainly those on perceptual grouping and object formation, which essentially explains how we as humans see and perceive objects that our eye sees and stuff on a plane, such as a map. Synthesizing these together, I try to use them to inform a better and thorough research and give a clearer picture of this complex interplay of all these very complex theories and literature. So With that, a user study was conducted to examine examine schemes for visual contrast and hierarchy development. Again, the two criteria were the perceived clarity of visual hierarchy and aesthetic preference. I structured it as a randomized incomplete block design experiment using a pool of 210 non-specialist participants solicited from Amazon Mechanical Turk. So the test variables, the main test variables are the contrast variables. So I had a total of 80 visual contrast schemes. Of them, they're based off two lightness states, so dark versus light background at 2 level, high versus low lightness contrast, together with 10 hue pairs representing a range of hue used in cartography at high versus low level, and then 2 level of line, in this case, line weight contrast. Together, in order to maintain a logical lightness variation, I did choose, and with the help of Cindy, I chose to use the Munsell color space, which is more optimal when focusing on lightness variation. And to keep the schemes used in this experiment realistic to real-world projects, hue were explicitly chosen to stay within the blue to green blue, purple to green range, which we anchor them into representing water elements on our test maps. So these 80 schemes were then applied to a range of base maps or base map parameters, which were derived again of a previous cartographic project to keep it grounded and realistic. These base maps have 3 main parameters, meaning they are representative of a bunch of geography and scale. So they uses 3 level of land to water ratio, so 0, 25, 50. They use a bunch of test locations, 6 in total, and they pull in or is representative of large and medium scale. So a total, from this, a total of 480 contrast map displays were constructed, sorta. So this basically just shows 80 of the tested map frames for a single location. This is just at 1 land to water ratio, at 2 line, 2 lightness, and 2 light background applied to 6 hue pairs. But these 400 map displays consists of 2 different maps. So in total, I had manual or partly constructed 980 maps for this particular study. So I'm going to try to briefly go through the main differences in the contrast variable. So this first map I have is focusing on the difference in lightness. So if you look at this hue space, so this is a Munsell hue slice of the 5 yellow, red, and blue, 5 blue. So the Munsell color space is a 3-dimensional color space, so it allows us to focus on the lightness variation. In this map, it's showing high lightness contrast, so the color chosen from that space is spread throughout the lightness space, which runs from the bottom to the top, dark to light, versus this map, which is essentially the same hue, same line contrast, same everything else, but a low lightness, so that it's squeezed down to only 3 level of lightness. And then we have the hue. So high hue contrast basically uses hues that are located farther away from each other on the color wheel. And so they're more complementary versus low hue contrast, which uses more adjacent and analogous colors. Together, they're applied with the 2 level of line variation. So this is high line contrast, which has more variation in line weights for each objects on the map versus this one, which has a more uniform line weight applied to the map. And then we also have to counter for the lightness background or the background lightness orientation. So it can be light background with dark foreground versus a dark foreground with light background. So the user study, again, it was done using Mechanical Turk with Qualtrics. So each user was shown 5 randomized group map displays. They were asked to do two parts, a task, and answer 2 statements regarding each map. So in part 1, they essentially were shown this annotated randomized map with these randomized letters, and they were asked to rank them from what they thought was most important to least important. So we try to keep this as abstract as possible. We're not giving them, well, they can sort of guess what the map is and what the feature represents, but we're not prompting them of what is the focus or what we want them to look at. We want it to be very inherent of what they see themselves. So yeah, they were asked to arrange them from what they thought was most important to least important. And then they repeated this for 4 other maps. And then in part 2, that were representative of different schemes and different geographies. In part 2, we asked them to answer answer back to 2 statements. The first one is asking whether the relative importance, whether it is clear to them. So now we're asking them about the clarity of visual hierarchy in the map. So the map now is more realistic. It has a locator, and it has labels. And in part 2, we asked them again about whether this map is visually appealing. So it's touching on that aesthetic preference to the map. Again, they do this for 4 other maps, so 5 maps in total. And then analyzing the results, I analyze the results using SPSS in general or multivariate general linear regression model. The predictor response, or the participant response, my bad, were the independent variables, and the dependent variables were the results of the user study, the ranking task, and the rating based on the statements. The Manoa was examined the effect of independent variable on each classes, and basically touching on the more interesting aspect of the results. So from the ranking tasks, we found that map readers were generally proficient at identifying foreground. This is somewhat to be expected. So if you look at the median results for each of the objects on the map, they were pretty much, so this is across through all the map tested. So map readers were essentially pretty good at identifying what they thought, or were pretty consistent at what they thought was the most important stuff on said map. So this pretty much aligns with previous cartographic research, no matter the points or the road features, no matter the color or whatever scheme that is applied to it. Map readers do see through that, but they're not so much proficient at identifying what they perceive as background features. So here, if you look again at the median value for the water and land, which is more of a background element, they weren't really sure what was more or less important there. Again, the ranking task did show a particular preference to a specific contrast configuration, which was high, low, high, and this is going to be a repeated theme throughout the other part of the study too. So in this only this contrast configuration did the users or the participant identify all the specific map element as on their own distinct visual level without any clear, yeah, they were clear about that. Sorry, I'm gonna take a sip of water because I'm going way too fast. Okay, so expanding on this preference, the general linear regression model showed that there was a direct relations between line contrast and the hierarchy of the road. Again, this is expected. Roads are line features, so it wasn't really a surprise. What was a surprise and unexpected was that the results showed that road features stood out more and ranked higher in terms of hierarchy on maps with lower line contrast, which essentially is the map on the left. So curiously, I discussed it with Cynthia and worked through what this meant. It seemed to suggest that having less line weight variation in total increases the perceived importance of the line features in the map as a whole. So basically, it's interacting with adjacent aerial feature, which in this case is a boundary for New York, and it's pushing that feature up or down in inverse of the rank of the line feature itself. For part 2, the regression model failed to show an empirical link between contrast of line, lightness, hue with perceived hierarchy. However, the regression model did show an empirical link between the contrast of lightness and hue with the aesthetic preference of the map. So without the line, though, if you look here, you can see that the performance for high lightness contrast together with low hue produced distinctly better rating from the study. But still, looking at the raw data itself, again, it comes back that there's a clear preference from all of the user to a specific contrast configuration, which again is high, low, high, whether it's the visual contrast, visual hierarchy level, or the visual aesthetic preference. So more interestingly, when we ran a correlation analysis on the results of these two, there was a clear positive correlation between the score of the perceived clarity of visual hierarchy and the aesthetic preference. Essentially, it means that user perceived maps that were aesthetically poor is also bad in terms of representing visual hierarchy and vice versa. So coming back to the research question, answering them, the first one, are high level of line lightness and hue contrast better for perceived hierarchy? No, not explicitly. The result didn't show that. It wasn't able to provide an empirical link between the contrast. However, however, the clarity of visual contrast itself is linked to the aesthetics from the correlation analysis, and whether the same level of contrast, the second question, whether the same level of contrast better for map aesthetic. Again, no, it wasn't, but it did show that the combination of high lightness with low hue was better. Again, regardless of the analysis, there was a clear preference in what the user preferred in terms of this contrast configuration. So in summary, users had a clear preference of what they like in terms of the 3 visual contrast variable tested. The configuration of contrast variable did affect the rank and hierarchy of the feature. The map perceived visual clarity of visual hierarchy is empirically linked to the aesthetics. Yes, and thus, we can say that maps that are aesthetically bad is also visually bad, and vice versa in a way. And that we did find a specific contrast that is most effective, and that the addition of more contrast variable did nominally improve this. So I'm just going to go briefly through what was the best. So using the results of the experiment, I was able to reapply the finding to the map tested to determine the top or the best performing map scheme. So apparently this is what users deem as the most optimal in terms of aesthetics and visual hierarchy communication. Curiously, well, Cindy already said people just like their purple and their blues. That's what she said when I showed her this. I don't personally love this scheme, but hey, it works. But yeah, again, these schemes are actually scheme sets, so they work through a range of geographies. They work on both the light background version and the dark background version. Another scheme is green to blue, and the other scheme is blue magenta. Again, people love blue and purples. And then these are some of the worst rated schemes. So avoid this scheme. This is the most poor schemes from the user study: magenta green, and also orange cyan, and orange purple. So takeaways, cartographers, so clarity of visual contrast and map aesthetic is crucial for map communication and is empirically linked, and we as cartographers must recognize and implement these contrasts to convey the desired visual hierarchy. Thank you. You may tweet me or email me or